So I'm wondering if anybody can hear me or indeed see me, or am I yelling into the void, as so often seems to be the case these days? Um, every online thing I seem to do demands a new reckoning with technology. Here is tonight's. Um, the first thing I'm supposed to say is hello, I'm Ian Rankin, and we are here at home with four indies, independent bookshops, who set this up. And thank you very much to them for doing it. And copies of my latest paperback are available. Not here, obviously. Where is it? There it is. Literally just come out. Available from Lingham's, Booka, Bookish, and Forum Bookshop. That's the sales pitch over and done with. It's kind of hard to sell books when bookshops aren't physically open. Um, but let's keep going. Let's see how we get on. The other thing is I've not got, I mean, I've got an audience, but I don't know how I can see some messages down the sides, whether I can keep up with all those or not. It's a bit like being a radio DJ. Not that I've done much of that, but I've seen them in action and they're controlling 10 different things at once. I'm afraid I'm a very simple soul who only likes to do one thing at one time. Um, that goes for writing novels. It goes for everything. And the reason I'm here tonight is partly because West Wind has been reissued. It's a book of mine that I wrote many years ago, 30 years ago it was published, 1990, and it sank without trace. The kind of dreaded lead balloon. I think there was one review in a Scottish newspaper, sold very few copies, and as a result of that became highly collectible. And because I had fallen out of love with the book, I never allowed it to be reissued, even when I became fairly successful as a writer. So copies became incredibly expensive and hard to find, and people were paying silly money, even for ex-library copies and paperbacks. I don't even have a paperback. I was looking to show you one. There's the original hardcover. You see that? And the young author on the back. Wait. Um, Let me tell you about that. That photograph taken by Malcolm Stewart. Malcolm and I worked together in London in a magazine called Hi-Fi Review. He was the editor, I was a deputy editor. It was a shoestring production, although it was a national monthly glossy magazine. So, as well as being the editor, Malcolm, who could use an SLR camera, hands up if you're old enough to remember SLR cameras, was also the photographer. And you know, when West Wind was going to come out, I said, "Hey, Malcolm, let's go into the studio," which was this really grotty, dank, cobwebby basement with no natural light in Upper Norwood in South London. Take my photos. So he did. And he did a pretty good job of it. And I had that cheesecloth shirt for many, many years until it basically fell apart. Anyway, so Westwind came and went. I don't even have a paperback. So people were either buying this for hundreds and hundreds of pounds at sales, auctions, and on the internet, or else they could sometimes find this. Look at that jacket. Just look at it. Admire that. A spaceman, a space shuttle, large print edition, the large print edition, which really only went into libraries. Some of those came on the market, and again, that was fetching silly money. So, partly for that reason, I decided to reissue Westwind, and partly also because a fan said to me, "Look, I got hold of that book, and it's all right. I don't know why you don't like it." And I happen to have this very copy, the original hardcover, um, in my office on a shelf, and I picked it up and I read it, and I thought, it's okay. I mean, it's okay. It's fine, and it's also weirdly prescient because it's set. Although it's set in 1990, recognizably so. It's a 1990 where the political situation is somewhat different from from the actuality at that time in America. is leaving Europe, retrenching under a president who is not very friendly to Europe. And so the Soviets, because it still was the Soviet Union back then, are sitting on their eastern border, or their western border, I suppose, next to Europe, and rubbing their hands, thinking we can make some mischief here. At the same time, there's a communication satellite that goes a bit crazy for a short period of time, and that's what brings the hero of the book into the story, because he thinks, what happened up there? And at the same time, a space shuttle has crash landed, coming back to Earth, and the only survivor, the only British astronaut on board, has been found with a dead man's hands around his throat, as if the last thing the American astronaut was trying to do was to kill him on a space shuttle that was already crashing. Ooh. So it's not a rebus novel, okay? I mean, it's nothing like a rebus novel. It's a thriller written at a time when I wanted to make some money. The rebus novels weren't making me any money. I couldn't live as a full-time author. I was already being supported by my wife. She was the main breadwinner. She was a civil servant in London. I wasn't making a lot at my job at the Hi-Fi magazine, but I knew I wanted to give it up and go full-time as a writer. And I looked in the bookshops, I looked in the railway stations, I looked in the airports, and there were these big fat techno thrillers. And I thought, well, maybe if I write one of those, I will become a huge international success, a global superstar. As it turned out, Westwind was never published anywhere except in the UK. Not even my American publisher, who published the Rebus novels, was interested. It's nice to have it back. Um, so although I'm supposed to be telling you about Westwind, there is a book that's maybe even closer to my heart at the moment, because I've literally just finished it. In fact, tonight, maybe if I feel up to it, I am drinking a beer, so maybe not tonight, maybe tomorrow. I've got to get stuck into the proofs. That's the final piece of the puzzle, is reading the proofs, which is the last chance, the last gasp saloon for the author to pick up mistakes, typos, chronological mistakes, characters who are limping on page one and have no legs by page five, people with moustaches that mysteriously disappear, all those little glitches that can sometimes get past even the trained eyes, the last chance to pick them up. So I've got to do the proofs of a book, and this is not the final cover. A Song for the Dark Times, which is the next Rebus novel, due for publication, I believe, in October, all being well, lockdown willing and everything else. And if the world hasn't gone on fire by then. So that's really, Westwind, although it's just coming out in paperback, is there and available. But the book that's right in my head at the moment is this new Rebus novel. So I thought I might give you a little sneak preview um, as to what the book, not what it's about, but why I decided to write it. A Song for the Dark Times. People say, "Oh, that's a really good title." How did you know how dark it was going to be when you started writing it? When I started getting the idea for this book in September last year, I thought those were pretty dark times. I thought the world can't get much darker than this. We're plummeting towards the precipice. Whatever, it feels like the 1930s all over again. We've got the rise of the far right. We've got this and that. We've got economic uncertainty. We've got tensions with China, tensions here, there, and everywhere. We're going to ditch the European Union. My God, it's all going to hell in a handcart. And the notion of A Song for the Dark Times came to me. It's a line from the playwright Bertolt Brecht. And he had this line in one of his pieces. Someone says, when the dark times come, will there still be songs? Yes, there will be songs about the dark times. And so that was it for me. That just clicked. And I like a nice long title these days. I don't know if anybody else does. Reviewers might not because they've got to type it in. Bookshops might not because they've got to type it all in. They like a nice, short, crisp title. But A Song for the Dark Times resonated with me from the get-go. And I started writing the book, just looking at the manuscript here. I don't think it says this is a fourth draft. I think I started writing it in November. and then took a little bit of time off for Christmas, and then got back into it in January. And it was finished during the lockdown. Um, I'm very lucky, although I live in Edinburgh. I'm talking to you from Edinburgh just now. I'm very lucky I can afford to have another house, which is way up on the northeast coast of Scotland in a little fishing town called Cromarty. And it's been very lucky for me. I usually go there to start my books and finish my books. And A Song for the Dark Times was started, the first draft was started in Cromarty. And back in February, March, I drove up to the far north of Scotland, up past Cromarty, to where the book is actually set, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in a second, and got back just before the lockdown. So I never did get the chance to go back up to Cromarty and finish the book there. The book had to be finished in this very room. This is my office in Edinburgh. And behind me on the wall, can you see behind me? Two pictures. One is the original cover photograph, I think, for The Beat Goes On, the collected Rebus stories, and the photographer sent me the original, and that's it. Next to that, you can see two photographs, and it's basically rain on a street, and in the puddle, you can see reflected a little bit the sign outside the Oxford Bar. Um, the Oxford Bar, there's actually another photo. Yeah, you can see it there. That's the Oxford Bar sign over my shoulder. So the Oxford Bar has meant a lot to me down the years. I started drinking there when I was a student. A lot of cops used to drink in there. I decided early on that my guy Rebus would drink in there. There's no jukebox. The TV's almost never on. They don't serve any food. It's really just about conversation, escaping from the world. If you want to sit in silence, you can. If you want to chat to people, you can. You're allowed to do whatever the hell you want. And my God, I've been missing it the past few months. As some of you might know if you follow me on Twitter, my 60th birthday was at the end of April, and I walked to the Oxford Bar from my home. It took 20 minutes. In my pocket, I had a pint glass and a can of beer, very much like this one. And I poured the beer into the glass outside the locked pub and toasted, had a little toast to myself, and then walked home. And that was my birthday drink at the Oxford Bar. I was damned if a virus was going to stop me going to my favourite pub, even if I had to stand outside and not see anybody or pass anybody. As you will have noticed already, I do tend to ramble a bit. Um, I start talking, I don't know when to stop. I mean, I didn't really know the instructions for this until today. I hadn't thought to ask, and I said, is anybody interviewing me? Am I on with other people? Will there be other people in the, like on Zoom or something? No, it's just you looking at the screen of your laptop talking to an invisible audience. And there are questions and comments coming in down the side, and I do have some questions that I'm going to get into, and I'm definitely going to leave enough time to get to those questions. But I do tend to ramble a bit when I start talking. I mean, I sat down here tonight thinking, what the hell am I going to talk about? And hey, so far we're okay, I think. Comedians have a lot in common with writers. We often become very friendly. And I think it is that performance, it's that performative act, that notion that you have to stand up in front of a bunch of strangers and somehow entertain them for anything between 10 minutes and an hour. And it's just when you go on tour as an author. I mean, when I first went on tour as an author, I was petrified. I hadn't been given any lessons, any advice on how to do this. Stand up in front of an audience of strangers and stop them getting bored and hope that they like you enough that they might even go and buy your book at the end of the session. Who knew? And the first few times I did it, I was dreadful, dreadful, dreadful. I would dry up, I would stutter, I would shake. I would do 5 minutes and thinking it was 45 minutes. I would do 45 minutes thinking it was 5 minutes. But hey ho, trial and error, and you do learn. And nobody's ever beaten my worst ever experience. I've asked many authors, which was an American tour. And this was in a day when the American tour was planned from the publisher's office in New York. And the people in New York might not know the geography of the USA. And bookshops having all the power, if a bookshop on the West Coast wanted you on Monday, and a bookshop on the East Coast wanted you on Tuesday, and a bookshop on the West Coast wanted you on Wednesday, you would jump from coast to coast. It was crazy. So anyway, one day I did an event in Seattle for the usual 4 or 5 people. Stayed in a hotel, jumped into a cab, went to the airport, flew to San Diego. Now, Seattle is about as far north as you can go on the western side of the USA and still be in the USA. San Diego is pretty much as far south as you can go and still be in the USA. It was a long flight. And again, I got a taxi from the airport to the bookshop. The appointed time came for my event. There was me, there was a bookseller. That was it. At the end of the hour, they gave me a commemorative mug to take away with me. And I went back to my hotel to lick my wounds and wait for the next morning for another 7 a.m. flight to somewhere else. It's not, I mean, it's a first world problem, but it's pretty tough. And during that process, it does toughen you up. It gives you a hide. Um, and during that time, also, you start to learn what stories work and what stories don't. And what happens is you tend to start embroidering the good stories. So early on, one of the stories I told was the story when I was researching the first Rebus book. I was a student here in Edinburgh. I didn't know anything about the police or their procedures, but I was a research student. I thought, what do? I will write to the chief of police, the chief constable in Edinburgh, which I duly did. He had no idea who I was. I had no idea who he was. And I got a nice letter back saying, go to Leith Police Station and talk to these 2 detectives. They'll give you the information you need. They'll answer your questions. I turned up there looking like a tramp. It was the middle of winter. I was wearing a kind of, clothes bought from an Oxfam store and Doc Marten boots, unshaven, bloodshot eyes, haven't been up all night. And these 2 detectives couldn't believe the guy in front of them was purporting to be a novelist. So they asked me, "What's the book about?" And I gave them the kind of, the kind of rough idea of what Noughts and Crosses, the plot of Noughts and Crosses was. Not realizing, I swear to God, this is true, that a similar crime had happened fairly recently on the outskirts of Edinburgh, and that these 2 detectives were part of the investigation. So, in the nutshell, I became a suspect. Now, it wasn't much. All they did was they went over to the computer and they typed my name and my date of birth into the computer. And it was only afterwards I thought, they did that because they think I might have done it. I didn't realize it at the time. I thought it was just them showing me how computers worked in an investigation. Um, Now, during the years, my God, I have embroidered that story to the extent that I almost did jail time. But it did teach me a valuable lesson once I realized that, yes, they thought I was a suspect. And that valuable lesson was don't go near the police, Ian. You'll just get into trouble. And for years after that, I didn't go near the police. Um, what was I talking about? Jeez. Oh, I was talking about the new book. Was I talking about the new book? I was talking about the new Rebus book. Why was I talking about the new Rebus book? It doesn't come out till October. I don't know why I'm telling you any of this. You can't. It's not like you can rush off and buy it. But I do want you to order it from an independent bookstore, please, and get it from an indie. I know you support indies, or you wouldn't be here watching this and listening to it. And we've got some great indies in Edinburgh. And by hook or by crook, they've managed to kind of stay open for most of the lockdown. You order books and then go and pick them up, and they'll just put them at the door, and you go and grab them. They'll mail them to you. They've got little booths where the front door is now, and you can stand at the booth, and they will find the book for you and hand it to you, and do contactless, so there's no money changing hands. Um, and most of them are doing that. The Edinburgh Bookshop, which is a 10-minute walk from me, a wee indie up in the Bruntsfield area of Edinburgh, do that. Toppings will do that, and they've got a branch in Edinburgh now. The Portobello Bookshop, a lovely bookshop that's opened in Portobello, will do that. Golden Hair, I believe, are doing that. I'm sure Lighthouse are doing it. That's our main indies. If I've forgotten anybody, I do apologise profusely, but those are the main indies I can think of in Edinburgh. Um, and books have been a godsend to me during this lockdown, and I'm sure that storytelling, books have been a godsend to you as well. I found reading hard. I'm going off on another tangent now, but I found reading actually quite hard. I thought, like a lot of people, this is it. This is my chance to read Anna Karenina. This is my chance to read Solzhenitsyn. This is my chance to read all these, all the Don Quixote. all these great works of world literature, these big bricks of books that I've never quite managed to read. That was my intention at the start of the lockdown. Very quickly, I realized I had no attention span at all. So I've gone back to reading old books, books I know well, books I like, comfort books, you might call them. And I'm finding it really hard to concentrate for more than a few pages at a time. Um, Writing, I found okay. I've written a lot in the lockdown, not only finishing and editing the new novel. I've written a little play that you can see online, which is Rebus in the lockdown, Rebus Lockdown Blues, which was written for the National Theatre of Scotland. It's a monologue. You'll find it on, just look up National Theatre of Scotland or go to YouTube and you should find Rebus Lockdown Blues, where Rebus is played um, by Brian Cox, not the astrophysicist, but the fantastic Scottish actor, who, hand up, early on in the series when there was talk of doing Rebus on television, so I'm going back to the late 80s, I really fancied Brian Cox for it. I thought Brian Cox would have been a fantastic Rebus. Sadly, he was about to get very busy in Hollywood. He was in a lot of major Hollywood movies around that time, so we never did quite catch him. So to get him for the play was phenomenal and a real pleasure for me. And it's a lovely little play, I think. People had been saying to me on Twitter and elsewhere on the internet, how would Rebus be coping with the lockdown? Partly because they know he's a curmudgeon, so he wouldn't be wanting to follow the rules. And partly because they know he's got COPD, emphysema, as we used to call it. So actually going outside, he could be in danger. He could be in danger of losing his life. So he really is having to be very careful. And those around him who care for him, like Siobhan Clarke, his one-time colleague who's still a police officer, is adamant that he ain't going anywhere. She'll take Brillo the dog for a walk. She'll do the shopping. He just has to text her with what he needs, and she'll come bring it to him. So he's kind of. I was thinking about this. How's he coping? How's he coping? And the invitation from the National Theatre of Scotland to write something was an absolute godsend because it allowed me to exercise that, to put that down on paper. And then when he said we've asked Brian Cox and he said he'll do it, geez, it was a dream. It was a dream. So go watch it. Tell me what you go on Twitter afterwards and tell me what you think. The new book, the new book, the new book. We're doing okay. Yeah, 23 minutes in. Okay, a song for the dark times. I thought I might do a little reading for you. Like I say, this is a fourth draft. I don't actually have a printout of the final draft. I'm old. I'm old. Tangent, Ian, tangent. I'm quite old-fashioned. I like to print everything out, and I edit on the sides of the pages, and I scribble on, I underline things and circle things and write on the margins. That's how I edit. I can't do it. I get sent these email attachments saying, here is your edited manuscript. You'll notice down the side are all the, and I go, I can't do that. I just need it on paper. I need to print it out and do it on paper. Anyway, get on with it, Ian, get on with it. So a little bit, I mean, this is no spoilers at all. A little bit from the beginning, the very beginning of A Song for the Dark Times. Siobhan Clarke walked through the emptied flat. Not that it was empty. Rather, the life had been sucked from it. Packing crates sat the length of the hallway. The kitchen cupboards gaped, as did the door to the tenement stairwell. The window in the main bedroom had been opened to air the place. It looked bigger, of course, without the furniture and the restless figure of John Rebus himself. Bare light bulbs dangled from each ceiling. Some curtains had been left, as had most of the carpeting. She'd run a vacuum cleaner over all the bedrooms the previous day. In the hall, she studied the boxes. She knew what they held, each one written on in her own hand. Books, music, personal papers, case notes. Case notes. One bedroom had been filled with them. Investigations John Rebus had worked on, solved and unsolved, plus other cases that had held an interest for him, helping keep him busy in his retirement. She heard footsteps on the stairs. One of the movers gave a nod and a smile as he hefted a crate, turning to go. She followed him, squeezing past his colleague. Nearly there, the second man said, puffing out his cheeks. He was perspiring. She hoped he was all right. Probably in his mid-50s, carrying too much weight around his middle. Edinburgh tenements could be murder. She herself wouldn't be sorry not to have to climb the 2 stories again after today. The main door to the tenement had been wedged open with a folded triangle of thick cardboard, the corner of a packing case, she guessed. The first mover, tattooed arms bared, had reached the pavement and was making a sharp turn, left and left again, passing through a gateway. Beyond the small paved area, probably a neat garden in the distant past, stood another open door, this one leading to the ground floor flat. Living room? He asked. Living room, Siobhan Clark confirmed. John Rebus had his back to them as they entered. He was standing in front of a row of brand new bookcases, bought at IKEA the previous weekend. That trip and the clash of wills during their assembly had put more strain on the friendship between Rebus and Clark than any operation they'd worked on during their joint time in CID. Rebus turned, frowned at the box. More books? More books? Where the hell do they keep coming from? Didn't we make a dozen trips to the charity shop? I'm not sure you factored in how much smaller this flat is than your old one, Clark. Clark had crouched to give some attention to Rebus's dog, Brillo. Brillo's still there. They'll have to go in the spare room, Rebus muttered. I told you not to ditch those old case notes. Sorry, I told you to ditch those old case notes. They're sensitive documents, Siobhan. Aye, some are so old they're written on vellum. The mover had made his exit. Clark tapped one of the books Rebus had shelved. I didn't take you for a Reacher fan. I sometimes need a break from all the philosophy and ancient languages. Clark studied the shelves. You're not going to alphabetise them? Oh, Christ. Life's too short. What about your music? Same goes. So how will you find anything? I just will. She took a couple of steps back and spun round. I like it, she said. Wallpaper had been removed, the walls and ceiling freshly painted, though Rebus had drawn the line at skirting boards and window frames. The heavy drapes from his old living room's bay window fitted the near identical window here. His chair, sofa, and hi-fi had been placed as he wanted them. The dining table had to go, too large for the remaining space. In its place stood a modern drop leaf, courtesy of IKEA again. The kitchen was a narrow galley-style affair. The bathroom, too, was long and narrow, but perfectly adequate. Rebus had balked at the idea of a refit. Maybe later. Clark had grown used to that refrain these past few weeks. She'd had to bully him into decluttering. Thinning out the books and music had taken several long days, and even then she would sometimes catch him lifting an item from one of the boxes or bags destined for the charity shop. It struck her that he didn't have much in the way of family mementos, or what could be termed heirlooms, no bits and pieces that had belonged to his parents, a handful of framed photos of his ex-wife and his daughter. Clark had suggested he might want to contact his daughter so she could help him move. I'll be fine. So Clark had applied for a week's leave and rented a small van, big enough for runs to IKEA, the charity shop, and the dump. Cornison's the same as your old place, she said, studying the ceiling. We'll make a detective of you yet, Rebus said. That's enough. I'm getting a bit hoarse. I don't like reading my own stuff. I'm not an actor. I'm going to tell you something though. Like I said, this isn't the final draft. This is the fourth draft. And I showed it to my wife. Can you see that? And what she said was, it says several long days. Thinning out the books and music had taken several long days. And she put a question mark and an exclamation mark next to it because she reckoned it would have taken a lot longer than several days. So I changed that in the final draft. As far as I know, that has changed to the best part of a fortnight. My editor is, my wife, sorry, is my first editor. I showed you the title page earlier, didn't I? On the back, some of her handwritten notes. I'm not going to let you see those. Things that are wrong with the book. I showed her the second draft and she scribbled in the margins and she wrote notes saying, you need to change this before you show it to your agent or your editor, which I duly did. She is my first editor, my first line of defense. If it doesn't work for Miranda, it doesn't work. She's a reader. She reads everything. She reads more than I do. She reads a lot more crime fiction than I do. If it's not making sense to her, it's not going to make sense to the reader. So it's great to show it to somebody like that before it goes out into the big, wide, scary world. Hardest thing an author can do. Doesn't matter what stage of your career you're at, beginner, mid-list, at the top of your game, been doing it for 30 years, whatever. Hardest thing you can do is show it to somebody. It's like Schrodinger's cat. As long as you're the only person who's seen it, it's perfect. You think it's perfect. And then you show it to other people and they go, I don't understand. Why does he do that? Or would she do that? Or how can he get there in that space of time? Or how can he clear all this stuff out in a matter of a few days? Um, what might also have been at the back of my mind writing that scene is that we had recently moved. In May last year, we downsized. And as part of that process, a lot of stuff went to charity shops. Um, half my books and half my CDs and LPs went to charity. It was brutal, dear reader, but it was completely necessary when you're moving from a big, rambling Victorian house to a modern flat with very little storage space. Um, so that might have been at the back of my mind. I was kind of hoping that in that first few paragraphs you might think, oh, shite, Rebus is dead. Siobhan, his friend, his one-time colleague, is clearing out his flat. Now, I know you don't really, because if you've looked at the flyleaf of the book, or you know anything about my books, you'll know that he ain't dead. But I quite liked the idea of that for the first few, maybe to show it to my agent. Maybe I thought I was going to put the wind up my agent and my publisher, who don't know anything about the book. Some people tell their publisher, their agent, what they're up to all the time. They're doing it. No, I give them a title. I give them a few moments that might allow the publisher to start thinking about a jacket. Can you picture it might go in a jacket, the design of the jacket? But they don't get the plot. They don't get any of that until I'm happy with it. So maybe I thought, oh, when I show them this, they might think I've killed Rebus off in this one. Anyway, so he's moved. The reason Rebus moves is because he has got COPD. And I know people who've got COPD in real life, and stairs are a challenge and progressively a challenge. And Rebus lives in an old-fashioned Edinburgh tenement, the same sort of tenement I lived in when I was a student, writing the very first book. And he's up 2 stories, he's up 2 flights of stairs, and I just thought that's going to be very difficult for him. But I didn't want to move him out of that street, so what I decided was that the person on the ground floor flat, we call them main door flats. They've got a door. There's one door that will go up to the upper stories, and one door will just go into that ground floor flat. So that would come up for sale and Rebus would buy it. So he's basically moved 50 feet, but he's now at ground level. And it means I don't have to do too much change, and I don't have to suddenly research a new part of Edinburgh that I'm moving him to. I like that he lives in Marchmont, you know. Not many cops would live there in real life. I don't know any cops in real life who've ever lived in Marchmont. Certainly not in Arden Street, where I spent a happy couple of years as a postgraduate student. I'm going to go to some of these questions. I did see a question flash up, which was, will Ian still be doing the Cunard Literary Cruise, the Cheltenham Cunard Literary Cruise, which I think is due to happen in December, November, December. They've not cancelled it yet, so it's still in my diary. Uh, everything up to then's been cancelled, as far as I know. I mean, festivals in September, festivals in October even are being cancelled. My diary has got very, very quiet of late. I was really frustrated actually because in March I was due to go to America to the Virginia Literary Festival, where I was going to appear on stage for the first time with John Grisham, who lives locally. It's basically his festival. And I was really looking forward to sharing a stage with John Grisham, a writer I've admired, a man I've admired, a lawyer I've admired for a long time. And that got cancelled. I think I'm getting my money back for the flight. I paid my own flight. I was so keen to go. Sometimes the publisher pays, sometimes the festival pays. I think I'm getting a voucher actually. Right, a few questions. Let's go for it. Where did your love of reading come from? I don't know where these questions came from. There's no names attached to them. Where did your love of reading come from? Always, always read. When I was a wee kid, um, comic books, comics. The Dandy, the Beano, uh, Wizard and Chips. I mean, you name it, I bought them. I must have bought, I think at one stage I was getting about 8 comics a week. Comics were affordable literacy. If you were dirt poor, like my family was, not many books in the house, you depended on 2 things. You depended on the local library, and I haunted that place, and you depended on comics. And I tried to write comics. I tried to draw comics when I was wee. And then I got into music, and I loved music, but I didn't have any ability to play an instrument or money to buy an instrument. And I didn't know anybody who wanted to be in a band. So I invented the band in my head and wrote their lyrics. And writing lyrics for my imaginary band, the Amoebas, lead singer Ian Caput. That was the start of me writing poetry. Terrible poetry, but poetry. And at school, when we did English, I don't know if it still happens or not, but when we did English every week, you had to write an essay, but the essay was actually a short story. And I loved writing those short stories for my English class. Um, and so I kind of got into poetry and short stories from a very young age. And reading, I visited anybody's house, straight to the bookcases, straight to the newspapers and magazines. Um, there was books, programs on TV. I would write wee notes. That was how I discovered Ian McEwan. There was a program called, I think it was Paperback Writer, Melvin Bragg. And one week it was a young writer with his first book of short stories, First Love, Last Rites. And it was a paperback edition. And I went to the little indie bookshop that had opened in Kirkcaldy. Kirkcaldy, I don't think, which was the nearest decent-sized town to us. Village I lived in didn't have a bookshop. Had a newsagent with a few Sven Hassel books. That was about it. But this wee indie bookshop opened in Kirkcaldy, and I went down there and I bought First Love, Last Rites. I've still got it somewhere here, and I think I even managed to get Ian McEwan to sign it for me one time. So, I've always had that love of reading, but I was not content to just be a reader. I wanted to be a practitioner from the get-go. I didn't just be wanting to read comics, I want to write them. Looking at song lyrics, I want to write song lyrics. Reading stories, I want to write stories. Reading novels, I wanted to write novels. There you go. Was there a particular teacher who spotted your talent and encouraged you? Kind of leads on from what I've just been saying. A succession of excellent English teachers all through my high school. And one of them when I was in sort of fourth, fifth, sixth year, so 16, 17, 18, Mr. Gillespie, Ron Gillespie. He was young, he was in his 20s, and he was just very excited about being a teacher. And he was very clever. He was working class, solid Glaswegian working class. Um, First member of his family to go to uni, probably, then did teacher training, ended up at Beath High School, Cowdenbeath, and taught me. And he knew about T.S. Eliot. He would introduce the poetry, the lyrics of Bob Dylan in his classes or Neil Diamond. Um, we would meet after school. I shouldn't tell you this, but we would meet. Okay, I was 18, 6 year, final year at high school, turn 18. It was legal. We would meet in the pub after school, a few of us, his favourite pupils, and talk literature. We would just talk about books and writers and the beats and everything. And it was great. And my sister Linda once had to come and drive. She had to drive from our home to Cowdenbeath to take me home because I drank maybe one beer too many. Uh, Mr. Gillespie, God bless you. As far as I know, he's still alive, still with us, living in Dunfermline. I see him very occasionally when I do events. He was great. And what he would do is when I did an English essay, when I did one of these short stories I was talking about, he would actually read it out to the class. Sometimes I read sections out to the class. Remember, I wrote one about a guy who thinks, well, we think he's president of the United States of America. He's actually in an asylum. He's a nut job. And who knows where I got the idea from. And I called it Paradox. And Mr. Gillespie said, why did you call it Paradox? And I said, it's just a great word. It was actually the title of a song by Hawkwind. And I'd fallen in love with the word paradox. And he said, look it up in the dictionary because it doesn't play any part in your story whatsoever. So I was in love with words. I mean, the reading, the writing thing, I was just in love with. I used to do the concise crossword, the quick crossword in the Dundee Courier newspaper. And I would sit with a little dictionary with a kind of, Collins Gem, Baby Gem, Midget Gem dictionary, tiny thing. And I would look up words in that and I would write down a little note to myself. I've still got it. Still got my big dictionary here somewhere I got when I was about 16, 17. And the sheets of paper in it with really clever words and what they mean so that I could use them like paradox. Um, why did you decide to move to France to write? I didn't decide to move to France to write. My wife did. We're both of us living in London. We didn't much like it. We didn't have much money. We found London a very big, cold place. My commute to work every morning from Tottenham, North London, to Crystal Palace, Upper Norwood, South London, was 90 minutes each way, 3 hours a day spent commuting in London. So it was hard. And she found us a place in France. It was a kind of run-down farmhouse. You know, the windows were all broken, the roof tiles were coming off. There was no ceilings in some of the rooms. Some of the rooms you were looking up at roof tiles. And we thought, we're young, we've got no kids, let's give it a go. We knew France a little bit. In '82, we'd gone and picked grapes there. We'd spent a few months out there picking grapes, and we'd got to know the people who ran the vineyard, and we went out to visit them pretty much every year after that. I had no French at all. I got a C for my O level, my O grade, C, scraped a C, pass when I was 16. So suddenly at 30, we're loading up a van and driving. Our next door neighbours in Tottenham came with us, God bless them, helped us move. So we had our 2CV, our Citroen 2CV, our cat. We'd got the jab, so our cat could go with us in this sort of van, and we just drove everything 1,000 miles. No, it wasn't 1,000; it was 600 miles from London. It was 1,000 to Edinburgh. I remember that. 600 miles to southwest France, where I just sat and wrote. And suddenly there was a desperate need for me to make it as a writer because we didn't have any paying jobs. We'd both given up paying jobs and our savings were tight. So that's why I started writing 2 books a year. I wrote one rebus novel and one thriller under the pseudonym Jack Harvey so that I could sell 2 books a year to make enough money to live on. And it was pretty hard going. Who's next? Da, 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 da. Your first book, Pre the Flood. Oh, Pre the Flood. Would you be tempted to release it? Well, as part of the clearing out when we were downsizing, um, the National Library of Scotland said they would take my archive, manuscripts, correspondence, interesting stuff. So I went all through it, and part of that archive is my first unpublished novel, Summer Rites, Rites, which I think would take a lot of getting publishable. It's a solid chunk of text to start with. I didn't realize you're supposed to put spaces after full stops and commas, or indeed that single spacing between lines was anything wrong with that. So it's just solid chunks of ink every page. It must be very tiring to read. Anyway, that's the only copy there is, and I couldn't afford to photocopy it. So the original is all there is, a typescript. That is now in the bowels of the National Library of Scotland, where people who apply, I guess, can go and look at it. But I have no plans to publish it. It's a comedy. I thought I was going to be a comedy writer. It features a one-legged schizophrenic librarian called Janine, named after the character in an Alistair Gray novel. And there's a kid with special powers. He can levitate and stuff like that. And the plot revolves around the kidnapping of a famous American novelist by the provisional wing of the Scottish National Party. Don't expect to see it on Richard and Judy anytime soon. Um, how did your publishing journey happen? Slow. I mean, The Flood, my first published book. I tried. Summer Rites I tried with London publishers. Nobody wanted it. Put it in a drawer, started again, wrote The Flood, sent it to an Edinburgh publisher, Polygon, which was actually run by students. And I was a student at the time. And Polygon was quite a new venture. They printed 200 hardbacks, about 600 paperbacks, and they published it. And because it was published, an agent came asking if I was working on anything else. I said, yeah, I've got a novel about this guy called Rebus. He's a cop in Edinburgh. 5 publishers turned it down, maybe 6. I've still got the letter in the National Library of Scotland archive, naming the names. And then Bodley Head in London accepted it. They took it, and I was thrilled. So, but it sold very few copies. Didn't get me really noticed. For a long time, I was what's called mid-list, which means you're taking over. You're selling a few hundred or a few thousand, but you're not getting anybody really excited. And that was a state of play for a long time. And I was lucky. It was at a time when British publishing would hang on to you if they liked you, even if you weren't making them any money. Where did Rebus come from? He jumped into my head one night. It was the very night I'd gone into Polygon offices in Edinburgh to sign the contract for The Flood, came back to my digs that I shared in Arden Street with 2 other postgraduate students, and he just jumped into my head that very night. A guy who's being taunted by puzzles, by messages, and can't understand what they mean. And I scribbled a wee note to myself and I said, he may be a cop. The main character may be a cop. That was it. Do you have any oversight of the TV production? None whatsoever. It's a long story. I've not got time to tell it here. A little bit more now, maybe. I mean, the TV rights kind of reverted to me because it had been so long since they'd made a Ken Stott Rebus that the option allowed me to get the rights back. And a really good screenwriter has worked on a reboot, and he's got a 2-hour pilot for what we would envisage as something like an 8 or 10-hour series, using 3 or 4 of the books for the plot. So that's with TV companies at the moment, and that's been the case for quite some time. Where do you get your ideas for your stories? Everywhere, anywhere. They jump into my head. I read something in a newspaper. I go, what if that happened? I'm a news junkie. I cut things out of newspapers and magazines, interesting moments, interesting anecdotes. People tell me stuff. Go to the pub, come home with a story idea. Um, Boredom sometimes, just sitting there with nothing to do. You're sitting and nothing's happening, and suddenly your brain starts to create. So stories come from everywhere. Research, I probably don't do as much of that as I used to. I do enough. I mean, for example, for the new book, which is set in the north coast of Scotland, because that's where Rebus's daughter lives, and the plot revolves around something happening to her. I drove up there. I drove around. I looked at various villages and towns. What do I need? What time does it get dark? Do you get any mobile phone signal up here? Does it have a police station? Does it have a bus service, taxis, all that kind of stuff? Um, I did that and came back and then just started writing. For police stuff, for forensics and that, I've got a few friendly faces, although most of them are now retired, but I've got a few friendly faces. There's always somebody I can ask. If it's a procedural thing, if it's something to do with an autopsy, there's somebody I can ask. But I don't ask them very often. I don't want to become buddies with the police. I don't hang out with them. I hang out with a few retired cops, mostly because they hang out in pubs. Uh, what would you say to Rebus if you met him? It's not so much what I would say to him. What the hell would he say to me? We could talk about Edinburgh. We could talk about the Oxford Bar. We could talk about music. After that, I think he'd get a bit fed up of me. He'd see me as quite a vanilla character, not dangerous and dark and brooding like him, not as conflicted as he is, not led the kind of life he's led. He would see me as having been suckled by the state from birth. Free education, free university. I got paid to go to university, for God's sake. Halcyon days, folks. Um, never really to do a hard day's work, although I've done hard days' works. But, my wife helped me out in the early days. She was the main breadwinner. So he would think that we've not got a lot in common, although we grew up in the same village. We grew up in Cardenden. Um, but at different eras. He's a fair bit older than me, although I'm catching up on him. Enough said. Take us through a day in the life of Ian Rankin in lockdown. Pretty much every day is the same. Um, sit in the office, hopefully write something, get some reading done, listen to some music, go for a walk at some point, maybe buy milk in the morning, go and get a coffee, go buy some fish. I might go for a walk or a run. Yes, I go running. I started in my 40s. I went out today, I did 5K today. I don't run fast and I don't run long, but it keeps the lockdown weight off if nothing else. Um, but normally, I would say that no 2 days are the same if you're a successful author, because you can be going to festivals all over the world. You can be being interviewed. Often, if you're being interviewed, they want to interview somewhere that's photogenic, or else they want to take you to the Oxford Bar. Um, you might be having phone calls with producers or TV people. Anything could be going on. Whereas in lockdown, authors are pretty much hardwired for lockdown. We spend an awful lot of our time in solitary confinement, just us and a computer in our brains and our imaginations. And that suits a lot of us well, or we wouldn't do the job. I was one of those kids. Stick me in my bedroom when I was wee would be about 6 feet by 7. It was like a TARDIS. It was vast because it was filled with ideas, role-playing games, toys, music, everything. I could travel out into distant galaxies from that bedroom using my imagination. And I did. Da, 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 da. Do you still sing in your band? If you mean by band, if you mean Best Picture, which is my recent band, yes, but we've not done much. Half the band are in another band called Fat Cops, title Nothing to Do with Me. And Fat Cops put an album out and they've been recording a second album. So, well, half my band are busy with Fat Cops. My band doesn't get to do very much. There's only me and a drummer left. If I could play guitar, we could be White Stripes. We did play some gigs around Christmas last year. Supported Hipsway in Edinburgh and Glasgow. We really enjoyed that. We've still only got 5 or 6 songs we're really happy with. So an EP maybe in the offing, but not a full-length album at the moment. I enjoy writing lyrics. I was in a band when I was 19, as some of you might know, the Dancing Pigs, the second best punk band in Fife, after the Skids, of course. Um, and that got it out of my system for the best part of 30 years, but somehow here I am again, singing vocals. Let's just say vocals in a band. Singing might be putting it a wee bit strongly. What do you do to relax? Sudoku, cryptic crosswords, listen to music, reading books. Pretty boring stuff, really. Don't have much in the way of hobbies. I don't do airfix kits or have a train set or, you know, I don't investigate true crime as a hobby. I love going to the pub. Going to the pub and talking to people as a hobby. Going to the pub and not talking to people is another big hobby of mine, especially if I've got a newspaper or a book with me. I'll just sit in the pub with a book for hours on end. And then trying to stand up sometimes is problematic. Who's your favourite author? I could almost show you my favourite author. She's up there, framed on the wall. I'm kind of facing her every day when I sit down here to write. Muriel Spark. I did my PhD thesis on Muriel Spark. I've got the table she wrote Miss Jean Brodie on in the room next door. Met her only the once, but God bless him, there was a photographer around, and the photographer got a nice photograph of us, and I got to sign my copy of Miss Jean Brodie. So she probably is my favourite author. If you were talking about crime writers, people like Ruth Rendell and James Elroy, I learned a lot from both of those. Willie McIlvanney, of course, the Scottish novelist who also wrote some crime fiction. Dickens, Bleak House, one of my favourite all-time books. Jekyll and Hyde's another favourite. Robert Louis Stevenson. I just did a thing recently for Radio 3, BBC Radio 3. Was it? No, it was Radio 4. Radio 4, I did a thing about Kidnapped, Stevenson's book Kidnapped. The reason I went Radio 3 is I also did something for Radio 3, but that I think was Lord of the Flies, where they asked me to write a new chapter, write the next chapter after the end of Lord of the Flies. No biggie. Big birthday this year. What do you do to celebrate? I've already told you that if you've been here from the beginning. To celebrate, I had lots of plans. I had great plans. I was going to go to gigs, big dinners, parties for friends, go and see a film with my wife and son, you name it. I had tons of stuff I was doing. I ended up walking to the Oxford bar, drinking a beer by myself, walking back again. And then at night, the fish shop had opened. Our local fish shop had reopened, so we had fish and chips. My wife made chips, and we had delicious fried haddock from our great local fish shop, Eddie's in Marchmont, where I was again today, buying some cod, actually. Best thing and worst thing about being an author? Well, I mean, there's not many worse things, but you are always up against yourself. You're always wondering, will this book be a better, how can I make this book a better book than previous books? And it's especially difficult if you've got a series character, a character you've been writing about for almost 30 years. Almost, yeah. Um, it's hard to keep the series fresh, to stay interested, keep finding new things for him to do and for other characters to do. Not repeat yourself. That's hard. And when you start writing, when you get there, I've got a quote here somewhere. Where is it? I keep up here. Yeah, Iris Murdoch. Every book is the wreck of a perfect idea. Every book is a wreck of a perfect idea. So when the writer sits down and gets the idea for this book, they think it's going to be brilliant. It's going to be the best book ever written. And then you write it and it starts to slip away from you. The theme, the meaning, you've not quite written it the way you wanted to write it. It isn't quite the great novel you thought it was. So That's tough. The best thing about being a writer is not having to go to work. I've been to work. I worked as a tax man, worked in a frozen veg factory, worked in a chicken factory, worked as a journalist. I've done a lot of jobs in my time, worked in a vineyard. Um, Writing, which is something I've always done and always found pleasurable, largely pleasurable, um, beats all of them. It's great fun. I mean, basically, you get to be a child. I've said this before, but you get to remain a child. You're playing with your imaginary friends. You're playing role-playing games where you can have as many adventures as you want. And as a kid, you do that with toys and friends. You might scribble things down to help you with that process. I just write these stories down. I write these adventures down. It's cathartic, you know. It's a way of getting rid of your demons. It's a way of making sense of the world. It's a way of communicating with the world. If you can do it, not everybody can, but if you can do it, it is, I think, the perfect job. How are we doing? Oh, 5 minutes left. I've got two more questions. Who would be your four favourite people to a dinner party and why? Oh, I'm going to piss off so many of my friends if I start answering that one. I mean, I would have Muriel Spark and probably Robert Louis Stevenson. I'd have those two to start with. Um, Maybe Frank Zappa. Um, it would be nice to get some friends and family back who are no longer with us. I mean, my mum and dad died when I was very young. Mum died when I was 19. Dad died when I was 29. So my dad was around to see the first couple of books published, but not seem to be a success. I wouldn't mind having dinner with a pair of them. They'd be shaking their heads in wonder that I'd managed to make a living from telling lies. Would you consider writing an autobiography? Final question. No, I kind of done it. I did a book years ago called Rebus's Scotland, which was mostly me answering frequently asked questions, explaining where Rebus comes from, where I come from, why I write the books, etc. You know, I, I've not lived a very exciting life. I get all my adventures on the page and in my head. What is there to write about? Sat and wrote a book. That took 6 months. Toured with the book. That took 6 months. Repeat. Hopefully managed to get a holiday somewhere in the middle of it and had a few pints in the Oxford bar. I've also got a terrible memory. I'd be terrible. Somebody put a thing on Twitter today, and it was an interview that I did on stage in Manchester donkeys years ago with Anthony Bourdain. I'd completely forgotten about it. I'd forgotten that article had been published, but I'd even forgotten us doing that event. So I'd be the worst person in the world. Like they say, if you can remember the '60s, you weren't there. I was nowhere, nowhere at no time. I make it 2 minutes left. What have we got coming down the side? Oh, well, I'll be coming back to Canada. There were plans for me to tour Canada this October with a new book. Definitely, I don't see that happening now. I think the next tour will probably end up being virtual. It'll be virtual, whatever that means, whatever we do. I don't know yet. That's in the planning stages. It's frustrating. I've not been to Canada for a while, and my second favorite pub in the world is in Ottawa. Hello from Finland. Oh my God, I've not been to Finland for a long time either. Um, I owe you a pint. Good. Yes, that's my friend Stuart. You do owe me a pint now. Sorry, because I've not got time to scroll back and see all the other queries and questions. If anybody has got a question for me, you can always find me on Twitter. I'm on Twitter too much, some would say. But I'm going to shut this down now. I'm going to thank the bookshops again for having me. It's been fantastic to hang out with you guys. Lingham's, Bookish, and Forum are the four bookshops you should be buying Westwind from, and also putting in your order if they're local to you and you like them. Put in your order with them for the next Rebus novel. Hopefully, I'll be doing some events. They might be online. They might be, if the virus leaves us alone, in the flesh at some point in the future. You can keep up to date with everything I'm doing on Twitter anyway. I'm not really on Facebook. I've had to sneak my way into Facebook. They banned me. They say I don't exist. I don't exist. They say that I'm a made up, that someone's pretending to be me. It's me, Facebook. It's me. It's me. Thanks, folks. Have a good night. I'm going to finish this beer and I'm going to go watch some telly. Cheers.